a 260-pound monster rotting on a cheap apartment floor for 7 days. That is how George Godfrey died. He was the most feared heavyweight on earth, but physical power means nothing against the mob. When the Mafia shoved a loaded gun into his ribs mid-fight and ordered him to lose, he refused. So the men in suits did not shoot him. They just stole his paycheck, stripped his license, and starved him to death. The strongest man in boxing was erased by cowards who never took a punch. If you had a gun to your ribs, would you sell your pride to survive? Let me know in the comments. His birth certificate reads Phoebe Smith Williams. Born on January 25, 1897, in Mobile, Alabama, he did not grow up training in a clean boxing gym. His massive size came from brutal manual labor. He grew to 6 feet and 3 inches tall with an 80-inch reach. His weight stayed between 220 and 260 pounds of solid muscle. He built this body working on the mobile shipping docks. The job meant lifting heavy timber and massive cargo by hand every single day. The brutal work tore his muscles constantly. His body adapted to the pain by growing thicker and stronger just to survive the shifts. He used his legs, shoulders, and back to haul heavy weight across the shipyards. He soon became stronger than any other man on the docks. But Williams knew the cold truth. This kind of work eventually destroys the human spine and ruins the joints. The shipyard was going to break his body before he even got old. He needed to make money from his massive size. Before his body gave out completely, he packed up and moved north to Liperville, Pennsylvania. It was a tough industrial town full of steel mills and factories. Williams arrived with no money and no education. His only real tool was his sheer physical size. He quickly used it to make cash. He started fighting in illegal, bare-knuckle street brawls. These were not real sporting events. They were violent fights organized behind factories and inside dark bars. Williams had absolutely no boxing skills. He did not know how to move his feet or dodge a punch. He just hit people as hard as he could. When a man that large swings his fist, the impact is devastating. He took whatever punches the other men threw, kept walking forward, and knocked them out. He collected the local betting money. He learned a hard fact during this time. He could trade pure violence for fast cash. He fought because breaking jaws paid a lot more than loading cargo on a ship. By 1919, Williams entered professional boxing. The fight business was controlled by greedy promoters looking for men they could use and control. Jimmy Doherty ran the boxing scene in Liperville. He watched Williams fight and saw a gold mine. A giant fighter with raw knockout power always sells tickets, but Doherty knew the business. The name Phoebe Williams had no commercial value. It did not sound scary. It would not sell out an arena. Doherty did what promoters always did. He erased the fighter's identity. He stripped Williams of his birth name. Doherty needed a brand that boxing fans already knew. He stole the name of a famous dead Canadian fighter from the 1800s. He forced Williams to call himself George Godfrey. Williams had no power and no money to fight back. He had to take the fake name to get a fight contract. Phoebe Smith Williams was gone. He was replaced by George Godfrey, a human product owned by a promoter. The young dock worker was now officially locked into the boxing machine. George Godfrey started his professional career under his new, stolen identity. He fought from a standard orthodox stance. His right hand was his primary weapon. He did not dance around the ring. He did not rely on complex footwork. He walked straight forward. Opponents described fighting him like getting hit by a freight train. He used his massive weight to lean on smaller fighters, draining their energy in the clinches. By the early 1920s, he was destroying everyone in the local Pennsylvania circuits. The fans loved the raw violence. The promoters loved the fast ticket sales. He became a major attraction. The newspapers gave him a nickname. They called him the Liperville Ghost. The name stuck, but his local success was a carefully designed trap. The more men he knocked out, the harder it became to secure profitable fights. He was hitting a glass ceiling built specifically to keep him out of the money. The professional boxing industry operated on a strict, unspoken rule. They called it the color line. It was an absolute ban on black fighters competing for the undisputed heavyweight championship of the world. This was not just about social segregation. It was a calculated corporate monopoly. The heavyweight title was the most profitable prize in global sports. White promoters, stadium owners, and casino bosses controlled the championship. They knew that a white champion generated massive revenue from the majority white audiences across America. They actively protected their investments. They built a financial wall around the title. They fed their champions a steady diet of safe, manageable white contenders. Godfrey was the exact opposite of safe. He was massive, aggressive, and highly unpredictable. The boxing syndicate decided immediately that Godfrey would never be allowed to fight for the real championship belt. The hypocrisy of the sports system was entirely public. Jack Dempsey was the heavyweight champion of the world during this era. Dempsey was an international superstar. He made millions of dollars fighting hand-picked opponents. In the summer of 1924, Dempsey visited the Libreville Open Air Arena. This was the training camp run by Godfrey and his management. Promoter Jimmy Doherty saw a chance to make a massive payday. He directly asked Dempsey to sign a contract to fight Godfrey. Dempsey refused on the spot. He did not hide his reasons. He spoke directly to the sports reporters in attendance. Dempsey stated that Godfrey was simply too big, too strong, and too young. The reigning champion of the world openly admitted he was dodging a challenger because the physical risk was too high. The boxing commission did nothing. The promoters backed Dempsey. The media accepted the excuse without question. The next champion followed the exact same blueprint. Gene Tunney eventually took the world title from Dempsey. Tunney portrayed himself as a fighting champion, willing to face the best contenders on the planet. He publicly claimed he was ready to fight elite black fighters like Harry Wills. It was a massive public relations lie. Tunney carefully selected his opponents to minimize risk. When the sporting press asked about fighting George Godfrey, Tunney avoided the question completely. He refused to even acknowledge Godfrey as a legitimate challenger. The system worked perfectly for the reigning champions. They kept the belts, they kept the millions, and they never had to face the most dangerous man in the division. Godfrey was forced to watch inferior fighters secure massive television and radio contracts while he was locked out of the bank. Banned from the mainstream title picture, Godfrey was forced into the colored heavyweight circuit. This was a separate, brutal underground economy. Black fighters were not allowed to fight white champions, so they were forced to fight each other repeatedly. Promoters set up these matches to extract whatever money they could from minority neighborhoods. The pay was terrible. The schedules were inhumane. Fighters were forced to compete multiple times a month just to afford rent and food. There was zero medical oversight. There was no time to heal from concussions, broken ribs, or shattered hands. The promoters locked the most talented fighters in the world into a closed loop. The athletes were forced to cannibalize their own careers. They destroyed each other for pocket change, while the white syndicate took a heavy percentage of the gate receipts. In this segregated meat grinder, Godfrey crossed paths with Sam Langford. Langford is considered one of the most dangerous fighters in history. He was only 5 feet and 8 inches tall. Godfrey had a massive physical advantage. He was much taller, heavier, and significantly younger. But Langford was a master of surviving the brutal circuit. He knew every dirty trick in the ring. He knew how to break a man down mentally and physically over long rounds. Godfrey fought Langford 3 times. The physical toll of the relentless fighting schedule had already weakened Godfrey. He was exhausted, severely underpaid, and fighting strictly for his daily survival. The experience gap was fatal. Langford knocked Godfrey out twice, first in 1920 and again in 1921. These knockout losses were not simply a matter of athletic defeat. They were the direct result of systemic financial exploitation. Godfrey and Langford should have been fighting for million-dollar purses in massive stadiums in New York and Chicago. Instead, the system forced them into small, smoke-filled arenas to beat each other into unconsciousness for basic survival money. The promoters sold these violent spectacles to the public and pocketed the profits. They watched young men like Godfrey take permanent brain damage against seasoned veterans like Langford. The capitalists did not care who won or lost the segregated fights. They only cared that the real money stayed completely isolated at the top of the white division. Godfrey realized he was trapped in a rigged game. He was a gladiator fighting in the dirt, completely blocked from entering the palace. He was being bled dry by a system that viewed him as completely disposable. By 1926, the absolute control of the white boxing syndicate began to show slight fractures. The public demanded competitive fights. The promoters needed to build up their new generation of white championship contenders. To make a contender look invincible, you have to put him in the ring with a monster. The syndicate selected Jack Sharkey. Sharkey was an elite, highly marketable white fighter from Boston. He was being groomed for the undisputed world title. The matchmakers needed a massive, terrifying opponent for Sharkey to defeat on his way to the championship. They looked at the segregated circuit and pulled George Godfrey out of the shadows. They offered Godfrey the fight. It was a calculated business decision. The promoters believed Sharkey had the technical skill to dismantle the Libreville ghost. They expected Godfrey to take his payout, absorb a beating, and serve as a stepping stone for the Boston prospect. The fight took place, and the promoters immediately realized they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Godfrey did not follow the unspoken script. He stepped into the ring and realized this was his one guaranteed shot at the mainstream money. For 10 brutal rounds, Godfrey unleashed hell on the golden boy of the white division. He utilized his massive 260-pound frame to completely neutralize Sharkey's footwork. He walked through Sharkey's combinations, trapped him against the ropes, and battered him with heavy, concussive hooks to the head and body. The physical strength disparity was obvious to everyone in the arena. Sharkey was being systematically broken down. The crowd, expecting a triumphant victory for their white hope, fell into a stunned silence. Godfrey was minutes away from derailing a multi-million-dollar championship roadmap. The boxing machine immediately intervened to protect its investment. When a fighter cannot be knocked out by his opponent, he is knocked out by the officials. The referee stepped in and took control of the fight. He began breaking the fighters apart every time Godfrey secured an advantageous position on the inside. He issued relentless warnings to Godfrey for phantom fouls. He deducted points for illegal holding, despite Sharkey initiating the clinches to survive the onslaught. The officials completely handcuffed Godfrey's offensive output. They disrupted his rhythm and provided Sharkey with the mandatory breathing room he needed to survive to the final bell. When the 10 rounds concluded, the judges handed down their verdict. They awarded the decision to Jack Sharkey. The robbery was blatant, televised through the sporting press, and completely legal. The Sharkey fight cemented a cold, hard truth in the mind of George Godfrey. He could train relentlessly. He could possess superior physical power. He could brutally dominate the #1 contender in the world. None of it mattered. The regulatory commissions, the referees, and the judges were all employees of the exact same cartel. They would never allow a black heavyweight to legitimately defeat a white championship prospect on the scorecards. The system was rigged at the molecular level. After the Sharkey decision, the iron doors of the mainstream heavyweight division slammed shut permanently. No top-tier white fighter would ever agree to step into the ring with Godfrey again. He was officially labeled as high risk and low reward. He was exiled back to the segregated economy. With the undisputed title entirely out of reach, Godfrey focused on the only prize the system permitted him to hold. On November 8, 1926, he traveled to Buffalo, New York, to fight Larry Gaines for the World-Colored Heavyweight Championship. Gaines was a highly skilled, dangerous heavyweight, but Godfrey unleashed his pent-up frustration on his opponent. He overwhelmed Gaines with blunt force trauma, dropping him repeatedly until the referee stopped the fight in the 6th round. Godfrey was awarded the TKO victory. He was strapped with the championship belt. He defended this title 3 times, was stripped of it in 1928 due to promotional politics, and violently took it back in August of 1931. But the reality of the World-Colored Heavyweight Championship was a sick financial joke. The belt was nothing more than gold-plated leather. It did not come with million-dollar guarantees. It did not secure lucrative radio broadcasting deals. It did not grant him access to the massive gate receipts at Madison Square Garden or Soldier Field. It was a participation trophy designed to keep minority fighters complacent while the real capital flowed upward. Godfrey was the undisputed king of a quarantined market. He was recognized as the most dangerous man alive, yet he was still fighting for fractions of a penny on the dollar. The financial mechanics of his career began to suffocate him. The gross payouts for colored title fights were already marginal. By the time the money reached Godfrey, it was decimated. His management, led by Jimmy Doherty, took heavy managerial cuts. Then came the deductions for training camp expenses, sparring partners, travel, and medical supplies. The fighter, who absorbed 100% of the brain trauma, was left with the scraps. To maintain a basic standard of living, Godfrey had to maintain a punishing, inhumane fight schedule. He fought constantly, barely allowing his hands to heal or his concussions to subside before stepping back under the lights. The damage was compounding. His prime athletic years were being bled out of him in smoky secondary arenas. As the 1920s came to a close, the American economy began to fracture. The impending Great Depression tightened its grip on the boxing industry, and legitimate gate receipts plummeted. The stock market crash of October 1929 obliterated the economy entirely, forcing the old boxing promoters into overnight bankruptcy. A new, far more ruthless corporate structure immediately filled the power vacuum. Organized crime syndicates, armed with unlimited bootlegging capital from the Prohibition era, took absolute control of the heavyweight division. They did not operate like sports businessmen. They functioned as cartel bosses. By buying up fighter contracts, bribing athletic commissioners, and controlling the sports media, the Mafia transformed boxing into a massive engine for illegal gambling and mass-scale money laundering. They looked for desperate, underpaid fighters with no political backing to serve as their pawns. George Godfrey, completely broke, aging, and abandoned by the legitimate sports world, was sitting right in their crosshairs. To survive the coming decade, he had to make a deal with killers. At the top of this underworld pyramid sat Owney Madden. Madden was a convicted killer who ran the Hell's Kitchen mob in New York City. He controlled the Cotton Club, the rum-running routes, and the political machine of Tammany Hall. Madden recognized that the fight game was a highly efficient extraction tool. He just needed the right asset to drive the gambling revenue. He found that asset in Primo Carnera. Carnera was an Italian import standing 6 feet and 6 inches tall and weighing 260 pounds. He suffered from acromegaly, a pituitary gland disorder that caused excessive bone growth. The press called him the ambling Alp. The public saw a mythological giant. Madden saw a highly profitable circus act. The physical reality of Primo Carnera was completely hidden from the public. He was a massive human being, but he possessed absolutely zero boxing ability. He was slow, clumsy, and had a fragile jaw. In a legitimate fight against a ranked contender, Carnera would be destroyed. Madden ensured a legitimate fight never happened. The mob built a massive multi-million-dollar betting syndicate around the Italian. They completely engineered his undefeated streak. Madden's enforcers traveled across Europe and America, purchasing Carnera's opponents before the opening bell. Fighters were paid cash to take a dive. Referees were bribed to stop fights early. Carnera was paraded from city to city, knocking out men who were paid to fall down. Millions of dollars in illegal bets flowed through Madden's network on every single fake victory. The scam operated flawlessly until April 1930. The mob brought Carnera to California to fight a heavyweight named Bombo Chevalier. It was supposed to be another routine, purchased knockout. The fix was in, but Chevalier refused to cooperate. He stepped into the ring and actually started fighting back. Carnera was immediately exposed. He could not handle a live opponent. The mob's massive investment was in sudden jeopardy. The syndicate panic button was pushed. Between rounds, Chevalier's own cornermen, men controlled by the promoters, took drastic action. They took a sponge soaked in a harsh chemical astringent and deliberately rubbed it directly into Chevalier's eyes. Chevalier was instantly blinded. He stumbled out of his corner in agonizing pain, completely unable to defend himself. Before Carnera could even land a clean punch, Chevalier's handler threw a towel into the ring. The referee immediately waved off the fight and awarded the victory to Carnera. It was a sloppy, desperate cover-up. Chevalier was furious. He did not stay quiet. He went directly to the California sporting press. He publicly announced that he had rejected a cash bribe to throw the fight. He detailed the chemical blinding. He exposed the towel throw as a premeditated mob tactic to protect Carnera from a humiliating defeat. The Chevalier scandal blew the lid off the Mafia's operation. The public realized the heavyweight division was a rigged carnival. State athletic commissions across the country went into total panic mode. To save the optics of the sport, the National Boxing Association and state regulators immediately drafted a new, strict mandate. They officially banned cornermen from throwing in the towel to stop a fight. The rule change stripped the mob of their primary safety valve. They could no longer rely on a corrupt handler to end a fight if their golden goose was getting beaten. Moving forward, a fighter had to either be knocked unconscious, disqualified, or quit on his own stool. Madden faced a critical financial crisis. The public was boycotting Carnera's fights. The gambling revenue was drying up. The syndicate needed to instantly legitimize their heavyweight prospect. Carnera needed to brutally defeat a widely feared, highly credible opponent in a high-profile arena. The mob scoured the heavyweight landscape for the perfect victim. They needed a man with a terrifying reputation to make the victory look authentic. More importantly, they needed a man with zero political protection, zero mob backing, and absolutely no leverage to fight back when the fix was ordered. They locked their sights on George Godfrey. He was the perfect target. He was the world-colored heavyweight champion. The boxing public knew Godfrey was a devastating puncher who had destroyed dozens of men. If Carnera could beat the Leaperville Ghost, the public would instantly buy back into the myth of the invincible Italian giant. Godfrey was also completely financially destitute. The legitimate promoters had starved him out. He was aging, desperate for cash, and operated outside the protective bubble of the white boxing syndicate. Nobody in the media would investigate his defeat. Nobody in law enforcement would care if he was coerced. The mob drafted the contract. The location was set for Shibe Park in Philadelphia. The date was June 23, 1930. George Godfrey was marching blindly into an execution chamber. June 23, 1930, Shibe Park in Philadelphia was transformed into a massive engine of illegal commerce. The baseball stadium was packed with tens of thousands of spectators. A heavy blanket of cigar smoke hung over the ring under the glaring stadium lights. The public believed they were purchasing tickets to witness a legitimate athletic contest. They were completely unaware that they were funding a massive money laundering operation. The organized crime syndicates of New York and Philadelphia had millions of dollars riding on the outcome of this specific bout. The betting lines were tightly controlled. Primo Carnera was the designated winner. George Godfrey was the designated victim. The script was finalized long before either man stepped into the arena. Carnera entered the ring first. He was a colossal human being, standing 6 feet and 6 inches tall and weighing over 260 pounds. The syndicate had spent a fortune marketing him as an invincible Italian giant. They purchased newspaper columnists to write favorable stories. They paid off previous opponents to take humiliating dives. Carnera was a walking billboard for the mob, generating massive gambling revenue every time he stepped over the ropes. But beneath the carefully constructed public relations campaign, Carnera possessed severe technical flaws. He was incredibly slow. His footwork was plodding and off balance. He left his chin completely exposed after throwing a punch. The mob knew he was highly vulnerable to a real fighter. Godfrey entered the ring next. There was no fanfare. He was simply a 33-year-old veteran desperate for a paycheck. The syndicate selected him precisely because he had no political leverage. He operated entirely outside the protected white heavyweight circuit. He had no powerful manager to complain to the athletic commission. He had no allies in the mainstream press. The mob bosses sitting ringside expected total compliance. They expected Godfrey to absorb a few moderate punches, feign a knockout, and collect his minimal purse. They viewed him not as an athlete, but as a disposable asset meant to validate their multi-million-dollar investment. The bell rang to start the first round. The plan immediately disintegrated. The syndicate fundamentally misunderstood the psychology of a man who had spent his entire life fighting for basic survival. Godfrey had endured the brutal labor camps of the Alabama docks. He had survived the savage, unregulated brawls of the Pennsylvania steel towns. He had battled his way through the segregated colored circuit where men fought to the brink of death for pocket change. When he stood across the ring from Carnera, his primal instincts took absolute control. He looked at the towering Italian and recognized the glaring lack of skill. The sheer professional pride of a seasoned heavyweight kicked in. Godfrey refused to execute the script. He refused to lie down for a fraud. Godfrey established dominance within the first 3 minutes. He ignored the mob mandate entirely. He crouched low, completely neutralizing the height advantage of his opponent. He stepped inside the guard of the giant and unleashed his 80-inch reach. Godfrey drove heavy, concussive hooks directly into the ribs and jaw of Carnera. The impact of the blows echoed across the front rows of Scheid Park. Carnera looked instantly panicked. He had spent months fighting men who were paid to fall down. He was entirely unprepared for a 260-pound veteran actively trying to take his head off. The first round ended with Carnera stumbling back to his corner, his face marked by the sheer force of a legitimate heavyweight striker. Round 2 commenced, and the violence escalated. Godfrey systematically dismantled the Italian prospect. He used precise footwork to pivot away from the clumsy, looping punches Carnera threw. Every time Carnera missed, Godfrey countered with extreme prejudice. He landed blunt force trauma to the temple and the orbital bone. Carnera began to bleed. His massive frame was sluggish and uncoordinated under real physical pressure. The crowd inside Scheid Park grew increasingly restless. They were witnessing the systemic destruction of a heavily favored giant. The illusion of the invincible mob asset was rapidly crumbling under the stadium lights. The economic reality of the situation hit the front rows immediately. Owney Madden and the syndicate bosses sitting ringside realized their empire was on the verge of collapse. Millions of dollars in illicit bets were tied directly to a Carnera victory. The bootlegging revenue laundered through the fight game was suddenly at risk. If Carnera was knocked unconscious, the entire financial structure of the heavyweight division would implode. The mob could not simply throw in the towel to save their fighter. The recent athletic commission rulings had explicitly banned cornermen from ending a fight. The referee could not stop the bout without a highly suspicious reason. The mob bosses were trapped watching their golden goose get battered into a bloody mess. Round 3 was a brutal one-sided execution. Godfrey showed absolutely no mercy. He backed Carnera against the ropes and unloaded heavy artillery. He targeted the liver to drain the stamina of the giant. He threw overhand rights that snapped Carnera's head back violently. The Italian was surviving purely on immense physical size, absorbing a level of punishment that would have hospitalized a smaller man. Carnera was gasping for air, his eyes swelling, his defense completely non-existent. Godfrey was punishing the man in front of him, but he was also punishing the entire corrupt system that had starved him for over a decade. He was publicly humiliating the exact same cartel that had locked him out of the legitimate championship picture. Round 4 sealed the panic for the underworld. Godfrey continued the assault with clinical precision. Carnera was staggering blindly around the ring, holding onto Godfrey just to remain upright. The crowd was roaring, fully aware that a catastrophic upset was unfolding. The referee looked nervously toward the promoters at ringside, waiting for a signal, but there was no legal mechanism to intervene. Carnera barely survived the final seconds of the round. The bell rang, saving him from a devastating knockout. Both fighters returned to their respective corners for the mandatory 1-minute rest period. The atmosphere inside Sheeb Park shifted from a sporting event to a crime scene in a matter of seconds. The syndicate bosses did not hesitate. The financial losses were too immense to allow the 5th round to proceed naturally. The unwritten rules of civil society were entirely suspended. Men wearing heavy trench coats stood up from the front rows. They bypassed the ringside press corps, walked directly up the steel steps, and leaned over the ring apron. The corruption was absolute and entirely visible. Dozens of uniformed Philadelphia police officers were stationed throughout the arena. The athletic commission inspectors were standing mere feet away. Nobody moved, nobody intervened. The state authorities were completely compromised, entirely bought and paid for by the exact men leaning into the ring. One of the enforcers locked eyes with George Godfrey. He did not draw a weapon. He did not need to. The message was delivered with clinical, cold-blooded finality, activating a death threat that had already been established in the locker room hours before the opening bell. The directive delivered in that corner was not a negotiation. Godfrey was ordered to collapse in the 5th round. If he refused, the enforcer promised him he would not survive the short walk from the ring back to the dressing room. The entire stadium was watching. Yet the most terrifying heavyweight on the planet was left completely isolated, trapped by syndicate assassins, while the law enforcement of Pennsylvania simply looked the other way. The 60-second rest period concluded. The timekeeper struck the bell to signal the start of the 5th round. The sound echoed through the smoke-filled expanse of Sheeb Park. For George Godfrey, that bell was the absolute deadline for the most critical decision of his life. The armed enforcer retreated from the ring apron, melting back into the shadows of the front rows, leaving the heavy threat of the revolver lingering in the humid air. The parameters of the trap were completely locked. The boxing commission had explicitly outlawed cornermen from throwing in the towel to surrender. Godfrey was entirely isolated under the stadium lights. He faced a binary outcome. If he continued to batter Primo Carnera and secured the knockout, the syndicate would execute him before he reached the locker room. If he chose to live, he was required to absorb a punch, collapse to the canvas, and pretend to be rendered unconscious by a fraud. For a heavyweight fighter who had spent his entire existence surviving raw, unfiltered violence, the concept of a deliberate dive was the ultimate psychological violation. It required a man to willingly strip himself of his professional dignity in front of tens of thousands of paying spectators. Godfrey possessed too much pride to fake a knockout. He refused to give the mob the visual satisfaction of seeing him physically dominated by their manufactured asset. He calculated a third option. He stepped out of his corner and walked directly toward the center of the ring. Carnera was still bleeding, exhausted, and visibly terrified of the impending contact. The Italian giant raised his gloves, expecting another barrage of heavy hooks to the jaw. Godfrey did not aim for the head. He bypassed the entire defensive guard. He lowered his center of gravity, planted his heavy boots into the canvas, and unleashed a massive unmitigated hook directly into Carnera's groin. The low blow was not an accident. It was a calculated, deliberate act of absolute sabotage. It was executed with the full kinetic force of a 260-pound striker. It was a blatant violation of the unified rules of boxing, performed directly in the line of sight of the referee. The impact was devastating. Carnera collapsed instantly. The 260-pound Italian crashed onto the canvas, writhing in legitimate agony, clutching his midsection and screaming. The referee did not hesitate. He immediately stepped over the fallen fighter, waved his arms, and officially disqualified George Godfrey. The fight was over. The mob secured the required victory for their million-dollar property. The illegal betting lines held secure, but the syndicate was deprived of their clean knockout. Godfrey forced the Athletic Commission to end the fight on a technicality. He lost the bout, but he kept his life, and he walked out of the ring on his own 2 feet. The retribution from the boxing establishment was immediate, ruthless, and entirely coordinated. The organized crime syndicates did not operate in a vacuum. They worked in direct partnership with the regulatory bodies designed to oversee the sport. The National Boxing Association functioned as a legal shield for the underworld. Within hours of the Shibe Park disqualification, the NBA convened to deliver a crushing institutional hammer to George Godfrey. The commission did not investigate the sudden appearance of armed men at ringside. They did not question the suspicious betting patterns or interview the police officers who stood idle during the extortion. They focused the entirety of their bureaucratic power on punishing the victim. The NBA officially stripped George Godfrey of his professional boxing license. They handed down a 2-year suspension. This suspension was a financial death sentence. A 2-year ban for a 33-year-old heavyweight effectively destroyed the final years of his athletic prime. The NBA ensured the ban was enforced universally across major jurisdictions. State athletic commissions across the country honored the ruling. Godfrey was instantly locked out of the most lucrative arenas, mainstream stadiums, and high-paying fight clubs in the United States. While he would eventually claw his way back into minor, unsanctioned bouts on the fringes of the colored circuit, his mainstream career was permanently shattered. The systemic punishment extended directly to his bank account. Godfrey had signed a contract guaranteeing him a $10,000 purse for the Carnera fight. In 1930, during the onset of the Great Depression, $10,000 was a massive sum of capital. The Athletic Commission immediately seized the funds. They held a brief closed-door hearing and ruled that Godfrey's deliberate foul constituted a breach of contract and a violation of sportsmanship. They officially confiscated half of his purse as a punitive fine. The remaining $5,000 vanished into the pockets of promoters, managers, and syndicate handlers. Godfrey fought for his life under the threat of a loaded firearm and left Philadelphia with absolutely nothing to show for it. The cartel extracted his labor, secured their gambling revenue, and legally robbed him of his wages. The blast radius of the NBA ruling did not stop with Godfrey. The syndicate used the incident to dismantle his entire support structure. The commission targeted his management team. Jimmy Doherty was blacklisted. The Liperville training camp was effectively shut down. The boxing authorities refused to sanction fights for any athlete associated with the camp. The decision destroyed an entire microeconomy. Dozens of undercard fighters, sparring partners, trainers, and cutmen lost their primary source of income. The mob sent a clear, undeniable message to the entire industry. Any resistance to the syndicate script would result in total financial annihilation for everyone involved. The blatant corruption at Shibe Park sent shockwaves through the legal community, but the intervention arrived entirely too late to save Godfrey. The unchecked power of the boxing cartel caught the attention of aggressive prosecutors across the country, most notably Alameda County District Attorney Earl Warren in California. Warren recognized that the state athletic commissions were deeply compromised and that local law enforcement was often on the payroll of the promoters. He began drafting strict criminal legislation designed to bypass the sports commissions entirely. Warren pushed to make the fixing of sporting events a direct felony under state law, giving prosecutors the jurisdiction to arrest promoters and mob figures for racketeering. It was a massive step toward cleaning up the industry, but legislation is strictly reactive. The new laws could not retroactively prosecute the syndicate bosses in Pennsylvania. The mobsters who threatened Godfrey faced zero legal consequences. The final phase of the system's retaliation was the complete assassination of Godfrey's public reputation. The sporting press of the 1930s was highly complicit in the corruption of the era. Many prominent boxing columnists and radio broadcasters were actively receiving cash bribes from mob promoters to build up fighters like Primo Carnera. They sat at ringside in Philadelphia. They witnessed the entire event. Yet, the newspapers the following morning printed absolutely nothing about the coercion or the gunmen. The sports pages ran massive headlines branding George Godfrey a dirty fighter. They called him a coward who took the easy way out because he was afraid of Carnera's punching power. They completely validated the disqualification. The press shaped the historical narrative, cementing Carnera as a legitimate contender while discarding Godfrey as a disgrace to the heavyweight division. Stripped of his license, robbed of his capital, and publicly disgraced by the media, Godfrey was entirely exiled from the mainstream economy. The boxing machine had extracted every ounce of utility from his massive frame. He had served his ultimate purpose as the credible victim required to launch the Carnera myth. Once the transaction was complete, the syndicate simply discarded him. He was thrown back into the crushing poverty of the Great Depression, carrying the physical damage of over 100 professional fights, with absolutely zero institutional support to break his fall. The state athletic commissions stripped George Godfrey of his professional boxing license. They banned him from every legitimate arena in the United States. But they did not eliminate his basic human need to eat. Stripped of his primary income and blacklisted by the legitimate sporting press, the 260-pound giant was forced to find an alternative method of survival. He turned to the only other industry in America that monetized physical spectacle, Hollywood. But the silver screen of the 1920s and 1930s was not a sanctuary. The major film studios were operated by executives who were just as ruthless as the boxing promoters. The California film industry was a highly segregated machine. It had absolutely no space for a powerful, intimidating black hero. Godfrey was forced to transition from a feared gladiator into a compliant corporate prop. Between 1926 and 1937, Godfrey managed to secure roles in 5 motion pictures. The casting process was an exercise in systematic humiliation. The studio executives looked at a man who possessed the kinetic force to destroy the heavyweight champion of the world, and they handed him an apron. In the 1926 Paramount Pictures production of Old Ironsides, Godfrey was cast as a ship's cook. He was ordered to stand in the background. He was instructed to look subservient. He traded the violent dignity of the boxing ring for the degrading stereotypes of white American cinema. He swallowed his pride because he needed the studio paychecks to survive the Great Depression. He was no longer the Libreville ghost. He was a background extra, hired strictly for his massive physical dimensions, and fired the moment the director yelled "cut." His final appearance on film occurred in the 1937 Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer production titled Big City. The studio cast him to play himself. He stood on set next to A-list superstar Spencer Tracy. The irony was absolute. Tracy was paid a fortune to play a tough guy on camera. Godfrey, a man who had survived actual mob extortion and bare-knuckle street fights, was paid a fraction of that salary to serve as living scenery. The bright lights of Hollywood were a massive illusion. They provided a temporary paycheck, but they could not hide the physical deterioration ravaging his body. A decade of absorbing blunt force trauma to the skull and ribs was taking a severe toll. The joints that hauled timber on the Alabama docks were failing. The neurological damage from fighting men like Sam Langford was compounding. In 1937, George Godfrey officially retired from the fight game. He hung up his gloves quietly. There was no farewell tour. There was no golden parachute. The aftermath of Godfrey's retirement exposed the brutal contrasting realities of the American sports economy. The organized crime bosses who orchestrated his downfall faced zero consequences. Owney Madden, the cartel boss who rigged the Carnera fight and held the gun to Godfrey's ribs, eventually retired. Madden moved to Hot Springs, Arkansas, lived in absolute luxury, and died an old man in a comfortable bed. The white heavyweight champions who enforced the color line built massive empires. Jack Dempsey used the millions he earned fighting hand-picked opponents to open a highly successful restaurant in New York City. Dempsey became a wealthy, celebrated American icon. Gene Tunney married into high society and became a corporate executive. The system worked perfectly for the men who owned the capital. The men at the top hoarded the wealth, while the men who actually bled in the ring were discarded the moment their physical utility expired. Godfrey did not receive a pension. The boxing industry offered absolutely no medical care or retirement benefits for its fighters. He spent his final decade living in complete obscurity in Los Angeles. The crowds that once packed Shibe Park forgot his name. The sports columnists who branded him a coward never printed a retraction. He lived alone in a cheap residence, completely isolated from the glitz and glamour of the Hollywood studios he once worked for. His massive physical frame, the single asset that had kept him alive since his days in Mobile, Alabama, finally broke down. He had no money. He had no powerful advocates. He was a ghost in the truest sense of the word. On August 13, 1947, George Godfrey died in his Los Angeles apartment. He was exactly 50 years old. His death was not heavily reported. It did not stop the boxing world. In fact, the absolute indifference of the system was perfectly summarized by the timeline of his discovery. Godfrey died alone, and nobody noticed. The man who was once the colored heavyweight champion of the world lay rotting on the floor of his room for a full 7 days. It took a full week before the odor of human decay prompted anyone to break down his door. He had no immediate circle of support checking on his welfare. The syndicate had extracted his youth, stolen his prime earning years, and left him to die in total, pathetic isolation. The ultimate hypocrisy occurred at his funeral. When the news of his death finally broke, the boxing establishment decided to put on a public relations performance. Prominent figures from the fight game attended the service. The attendees included former white champions like Jack Root and Gorilla Jones. The most prominent face in the crowd was Jack Dempsey. The same Jack Dempsey who had looked Godfrey in the eye in 1924 admitted the black fighter was too dangerous and refused to give him a shot at the undisputed title. The men who built the financial wall around the championship showed up to pay their respects to the corpse. They stood over the casket and offered belated praise for a man they had deliberately starved out of the industry. They honored him in death only because he was no longer a financial threat to their monopoly. It took the boxing establishment over half a century to formally acknowledge the crime. In 2003, the Ring magazine finally published a list ranking George Godfrey among the 100 greatest punchers of all time. 4 years later, in 2007, the International Boxing Hall of Fame officially inducted him into their ranks. His name was engraved on a plaque in Canastota, New York. But historical recognition is completely hollow. A paper certificate printed 60 years after a man's death does not pay his back wages. A plaque on a wall does not erase the loaded revolver pressed into his ribs in Philadelphia. It does not rewrite the corrupt scorecards or give him back the $10,000 the Athletic Commission stole from him. The posthumous awards are merely an attempt by the industry to wash its own hands. The facts remain permanently fixed. The capitalist machinery of the Golden Age created a physical god, extracted every drop of his blood for corporate profit, and tossed the empty shell into a lonely grave.